When the collapsed mine buried the very people who had scorned the woman I loved, I realized the only key to their salvation was her incredible strength, the very thing they called a curse. But first, I had to convince her to save the ones who had broken her spirit. And this story is about how it all came to pass. Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Harris, a man whose silence was as much a part of him as the weathered leather of his gear, guided his weary horse toward the collection of buildings that called itself Stone Creek. He had been riding for 3 days, descending from the high, lonely peaks where the air was clean, and the only sounds were the wind and his own breathing. The transition to the world of men was always jarring. The silence here was different. It was a heavy, watchful quiet, thick with unspoken resentments. He rode down the town's only significant street, a wide, dusty artery that seemed to have given up on ever being clean. The buildings, sun-bleached and tired, sagged against each other, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at nothing. The sign for the saloon creaked on its hinges, a monotonous, rhythmic complaint against the slight breeze. Harris swung down from his saddle, his movements economical and deliberate, a stark contrast to the lethargic stillness of the few men who observed him from the shade of a nearby porch. He was here for a simple, necessary purpose: to trade the small, heavy sacks of silver ore he'd painstakingly gathered for essentials like flour, salt, and cartridges. It was a transaction he repeated a few times a year, his only required interaction with a society he had long since left behind. As he tethered his horse to a well-worn hitching post, the rhythmic, powerful clang of a hammer on steel cut through the town's oppressive quiet. It was the only sound of honest work to be heard, and it drew his gaze toward the source, the wide open doors of the blacksmith shop. And that is when he saw her. Her name, he would later learn, was Martha. She stood silhouetted against the fiery orange glow of the forge, a figure of astonishing height and strength. The powerful muscles in her back and arms contracted with each swing of the heavy sledgehammer, her movements not just forceful, but filled with a focused, practiced grace. To the men loafing nearby, who nudged each other and whispered behind cupped hands, she was a spectacle, a freak of nature to be gawked at. But Harris, a man who lived by the principles of function and strength, saw something else entirely. He saw the way she read the glowing metal, the precise angle of each strike, the complete and utter absorption in her craft. He wasn't looking at a giant. He was looking at an artist whose medium was fire and iron. It didn't take long for Harris to identify the ringleader of the town's casual cruelty. Fletcher, the mayor's son, moved through Stone Creek with an unearned swagger, a man whose only notable quality was an unending appetite for reinforcing his own fragile ego. He and his 2 lanky companions made their way across the street, their boots kicking up dust, their destination clear. They stopped just outside the forge, close enough for Martha to hear every word. Fletcher began to speak in a loud, mocking tone, making a crude joke about needing a new barn door, and wondering if Martha could forge the hinges and then act as the door itself. His friends erupted in loud, braying laughter. Harris, watching from across the street, felt a familiar cold anger settle in his gut. He observed Martha closely. She didn't flinch or turn. Her rhythm with the hammer remained unbroken, a steady, defiant heartbeat against their taunts, but he saw the muscles in her jaw tighten, a small, hard knot of endurance. He considered walking over, but years of solitude had taught him that some fires are only made worse with more wind. His intervention would only shift the crowd's attention and likely make Martha's life even harder once he was gone. Later, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, Harris saw a different scene unfold. The town had largely retreated indoors, escaping the last of the day's oppressive heat. From the shadows of the livery stable, he saw Martha emerge from the back of her workshop. She moved cautiously, almost secretively, carrying a small wooden bowl. She placed it near the wall of an adjacent alleyway, then retreated. A few moments later, a creature of pure misery, a skeletal old dog with a raw, limp, and patchy fur, hobbled out from the darkness. It was a stray that Harris had seen the townsfolk kick at and curse earlier in the day. The dog drank greedily from the bowl and then devoured the scraps of meat inside. Martha watched from her doorway, her large frame cloaked in shadows, her expression unreadable but for the quiet act itself. This hidden gesture of compassion, offered to a creature as outcast as herself, told Harris everything he needed to know. The town saw her strength as a deformity, but he was beginning to see it as the container for a spirit they were too small to comprehend. He knew then that he would not go to the general store for his tools. He would have one made by her. The following morning, Harris pushed through the invisible curtain of heat and noise at the entrance to the forge. The air inside was thick with the smells of coal smoke, hot metal, and sweat. Tools of every shape and size hung in organized chaos on the walls, and the floor was littered with iron shavings and dust. He walked past a few men who were waiting for simple repairs, their conversations ceasing as they turned to stare at him. He ignored them and approached Martha, who was quenching a newly shaped plow blade in a trough of water, sending a great hiss of steam into the air. He waited until she was done. He didn't ask for a horseshoe or a knife. He unrolled a small stained piece of canvas on a clear spot on her workbench, revealing a detailed drawing. "I need a grappling hook," he stated, his voice calm and direct. "The steel needs to be tempered to hold a man's weight without snapping, even in the cold. The prongs need to be shaped like this to find purchase in cracked rock." He spoke to her as a peer, an expert seeking the skills of another. For the first time since he had seen her, Martha's professional mask wavered. Her eyes, the color of faded slate, showed a flicker of unguarded surprise. She studied the drawing, her large finger tracing the lines with a familiarity that spoke of years of practice. "This is a difficult temper," she said, her voice lower and softer than he'd expected. "It needs to hold firm, but not be so brittle it shatters." It was a statement of fact, a professional assessment. Before Harris could respond, a smug voice cut through the air. "Well, look at this. The mountain man found himself a mountain of a woman." Fletcher had entered, his cronies in tow, a malicious grin plastered on his face. He sauntered closer, circling them like a coyote. "Be careful with that hook, trapper. You wouldn't want her to mistake you for a nail." Harris didn't move a muscle. He simply turned his head slowly and fixed his gaze on Fletcher. The air grew still, the heat from the forge suddenly feeling cold. "I have more respect for the strength it takes to build something," Harris said, his voice level and dangerously quiet, "than for the weakness it takes to try and tear it down." A dark flush rose on Fletcher's neck, but for once he seemed to be at a loss for words. In the 2 days it took for Martha to forge and perfect the grappling hook, a tentative, unspoken alliance formed between them. When Harris came to check on the progress, their conversations were brief and practical, yet they were the foundation of something more. In the evenings, after the last glow of the forge had died, he would find a reason to walk by, and she would be sitting on the bench outside, letting the cool night air wash over her. He started talking, and she started listening. He told her about the quiet life of the high peaks, of tracking a cougar for 2 days just to see where it made its home, of the way the stars looked so close you could almost touch them. In return, she spoke of the life of iron, how each piece had its own spirit, some stubborn and some compliant, how the fire revealed its true nature. She never spoke of her loneliness, and he never spoke of his past, but they understood each other through the language of solitude and craft. This burgeoning connection was a spectacle for the town and a personal affront to Fletcher. He would watch them from the porch of the saloon, his jaw tight with a possessive fury. Stone Creek was his domain, its people, his playthings, and Martha was the primary object of his scorn, a tool he used to feel powerful. Harris's open respect for her was a disruption of that order. It was a quiet rebellion that Fletcher could not tolerate. He saw the way 1 or 2 of the townsfolk now looked at Martha with a sliver of curiosity instead of pure derision. He knew he had to extinguish this spark before it could catch fire. His power depended on the town remaining united in its prejudices, with him as their leader. He began to plan, his mind twisting for a way to remove the trapper and put the giantess back in her place. The opportunity Fletcher was looking for arrived in a wooden crate marked Danger, Explosives. A shipment of dynamite for the mine, owned by his father, was being stored temporarily in the locked shed behind the general store. The very next morning, the store owner discovered the lock had been broken and an entire crate was missing. The news spread through Stone Creek like a grass fire. Fletcher was the first and loudest voice to offer a theory. He spoke with grave certainty in the saloon, ensuring a large audience. "It's obvious, isn't it?" he declared, his voice ringing with false authority. An outsider, a mountain man who knows how to use these things, shows up right before it goes missing. He's probably planning to blast the mine safe. The poison of the rumor was potent. It played on the town's inherent distrust of strangers and their fear of the untamed wilderness Harris represented. The sheriff, a portly man named Gable, whose primary concern was keeping the mayor happy, dutifully began his investigation. He walked directly to Harris, who was inspecting a saddle at the livery, and began questioning him in a loud, accusatory tone. It was a piece of public theater, designed to solidify Harris's guilt in the eyes of the town. As the crowd gathered, drawn by the drama, a powerful voice cut through the sheriff's questioning. He had nothing to do with it. Martha had stepped out from her forge, wiping her hands on a leather apron. She stood tall, her presence commanding an immediate, shocked silence. "Harris is an honest man. He spent all of yesterday evening talking with me right here." It was a brave, reckless act of loyalty. But instead of clearing his name, her defense only served to link them together in the town's suspicious minds. The whispers changed. Now, they weren't just dealing with a thief, but a conspiracy between the town's two biggest outcasts. Fletcher now had the ammunition he needed. He convinced Sheriff Gable that a formal search of Harris's rented room above the stable was imperative. The search was a farce. Gable made a show of looking through Harris's meager belongings, while Fletcher helpfully pointed toward a loose floorboard in the corner. "Might want to check there, Sheriff." "Can't be too careful." Predictably, tucked beneath the floorboards were several sticks of the missing dynamite. Harris said nothing as the sheriff snapped handcuffs onto his wrists. He knew words were useless against such blatant corruption. With his prisoner secured, Fletcher gathered the townspeople with the air of a conquering hero. He stood on the steps of the jailhouse, Harris visible behind him in a barred cell. "This criminal thought he could hide among us," Fletcher boomed, pointing a finger at the jail. "And he was aided by the one person who has always been a blight on this town." He then turned his venom directly on Martha, who stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. "That monster in the forge gave him shelter. They were plotting together. Who knows what they planned to do to us, to our families?" For Martha, the words were like physical blows. She had spent her entire life absorbing their scorn in silence, building a wall of stoicism around her heart. But this public accusation, this twisting of her first real friendship into something ugly and menacing, was a different kind of cruelty. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, people she'd known since she was a child, people for whom she had mended tools and forged equipment, and saw no sympathy, only fear and hatred. It was the final crushing weight. Without a word, she turned and walked back to her forge, her powerful shoulders slumped in defeat. The great wooden doors of the workshop closed with a sound of finality, shutting out the world that had, once and for all, proven it didn't want her. Her spirit, so long resilient, felt as though it had finally been broken. The universe, it seemed, had a grim sense of irony. Not 2 hours after Harris was locked away and Martha had sealed herself in her workshop, the ground beneath Stone Creek gave a violent shudder. A low, guttural roar echoed from the direction of the silver mine, a sound like a giant clearing its throat. It was followed by a deathly silence, and then a rising cloud of brown dust that stained the pristine blue sky. The mine had collapsed. The very dynamite that had served as the tool for Fletcher's deception had become the instrument of a far greater tragedy. In their haste to follow Fletcher's orders to tap into a new, unsurveyed cavern, his men had used too large a charge, triggering a catastrophic chain reaction in the unstable tunnels. The main access tunnel, the only way in or out, was now completely sealed. Several men, including the two who had laughed alongside Fletcher as he mocked Martha, were trapped in the suffocating darkness deep within the earth. Panic, raw and unthinking, seized the town. Men grabbed shovels and picks, rushing toward the mine, only to stop in dismay at the sight before them. The entrance was gone. buried beneath a solid, monolithic slab of granite that had sheared off from the cliff face. It was an impassable wall of stone, a tomb door sealed by the mountain itself. The wives and mothers of the trapped men began to wail, their cries of despair echoing in the sudden, terrible quiet. The air was thick with the dust of the collapse and the choking stench of fear. The trapped miners had a limited supply of air, and with every... Fletcher, his face pale with a sweat that had nothing to do with the heat, quickly understood the precariousness of his situation. If the trapped miners were somehow rescued, the truth of his reckless orders would come out. Survival, for him, meant their deaths. He climbed onto a wagon, raising his hands for quiet, his voice filled with a practiced, somber tone. "My friends," he began, "it is with a heavy heart that I must say, there is nothing we can do. The rock is too large. We would only risk more lives in a foolish attempt." He painted a picture of heroic sacrifice, urging the town to begin mourning their lost brothers rather than clinging to a false and dangerous hope. It was a cowardly, self-serving speech, but in the face of the impossible, many of the stunned townsfolk began to nod in grim acceptance. Back at the jail, Sheriff Gable was no fool. He knew the town was a powder keg, and a framed trapper was the least of his problems. He unlocked Harris's cell. "Get out of here, Harris," he grumbled, not meeting his eyes. "The town's got bigger troubles than you." Harris didn't waste a moment. He walked straight to the mine, his mountain-honed senses taking in the scene with a cold, analytical calm. He studied the slab of rock, noting its size, its weight, the way it was wedged into the surrounding cliff. He saw what the others saw, that ropes would snap, horses would be useless, and a dozen men with shovels might as well be trying to empty the ocean with a cup. But he also saw the faint fracture lines, the points of immense pressure, and he understood the physics of the problem in a way no one else did. And in that understanding, a single, stark, and terrifying solution presented itself. There was only one power in Stone Creek capable of challenging a mountain. He had to go to the forge. The blacksmith shop was unnervingly quiet and dark when Harris arrived. The great hearth, the roaring heart of the workshop, was cold, a mound of gray ash marking where the fire had died. He found Martha sitting on a low stool in the deepest shadows, as still as one of the iron tools hanging on the wall. Her massive hands, capable of shaping steel, rested listlessly in her lap. She seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of the town's final brutal rejection. He approached slowly, his boots silent on the dirt floor. He didn't bother with greetings or apologies for the town's behavior. He went straight to the heart of the matter. "There's been a collapse at the mine," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet space. "Men are trapped. The entrance is blocked by a rock slab no one can move." She didn't look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the cold ashes in the hearth. He knew he had to choose his next words carefully. This wasn't a request for a favor. It was a demand for a miracle from a soul that had been given every reason to forsake miracles. "Martha," he said, stepping closer, "they wanted to break you. They wanted to see you fall just to prove to themselves that they were strong and you were weak. Don't let them be right." A flicker of life returned to her eyes, but it was the cold fire of bitterness. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking with a pain she had held in for years. "Why should I lift a single finger to save people who hate the very sight of me? They called me a monster." He knelt, a difficult thing for a man as proud as him, bringing his eyes level with hers. He reached out and gently touched her hand, a hand that could crush his without effort. "Don't do it for them," he said, his voice earnest and intense. "And don't do it for me. Do it because their hatred doesn't get to decide who you are. Do it because you are the only one on God's green earth who can. Do it because that strength they fear is your truth." When Martha stepped out of her forge and began to walk toward the mine, a wave of silence washed over the chaotic crowd. People stopped shouting, stopped weeping, and simply stared. She moved through them like a ship parting the sea, her face a mask of resolute focus, her eyes fixed on the mountain ahead. She carried no tools, but the immense power coiled in her own body. The crowd parted for her, a path of awe and fear clearing before her. They followed at a distance, a silent procession drawn to this unbelievable final, desperate act. When she reached the site of the collapse, she did not hesitate. She placed her hands on the cold, unyielding granite, her palms flat against the stone, feeling its texture, its weight, its balance. For a long minute, she simply stood there, communing with the obstacle, her blacksmith's mind analyzing it not as a single mass, but as a complex puzzle of stress points and hidden leverages. She found what she was looking for, a slight fissure near the base, a point where she could apply force. She braced her feet, digging her heels into the loose shale, her entire body becoming a living extension of the earth. The muscles in her back and legs bunched like thick ropes. A deep guttural sound escaped her throat, a sound of pure, primal effort that was not quite human. The rock groaned, a deep grinding protest from the belly of the mountain. It didn't move. She repositioned herself, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and tried again. This time, a collective gasp rose from the crowd as a visible tremor ran through the stone. With a final titanic roar that seemed to shake the very air, Martha pushed. The great slab shifted, grating against the surrounding rock with an ear-splitting shriek. It moved only a few feet, pivoting on its base, but it was enough. A dark, narrow opening into the mine was revealed. Martha stumbled back, her body trembling with exhaustion, and sank to her knees, her task complete. The first of the trapped miners squeezed through the gap, gasping the clean air, his face pale with dust and terror. Then another, and another. As their wives and families rushed to embrace them, the men's initial relief quickly turned to righteous fury. "It was Fletcher," one of them yelled, his voice hoarse. "He made us use the extra charges. He said the mayor wanted the tunnel opened by week's end, no matter the risk." Another miner, coughing and spitting dust, pointed a trembling finger at the mayor's son, who was trying to shrink back into the crowd. "He knew it was unstable, we told him. He almost got us all killed for a few extra dollars of silver." The truth, once unleashed, was as unstoppable as a rock slide. The crowd, which moments before had been a collection of grieving families, transformed into an angry mob. They turned as one, their faces a mixture of fury and dawning comprehension, and began to advance on Fletcher. His arrogance finally shattered, replaced by pure animal panic. Sheriff Gable, seeing the direction the wind was blowing, stepped forward and decisively grabbed Fletcher's arm. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear, a man salvaging his own authority from the wreckage of the mayor's. As Fletcher was led away, the townspeople turned their attention back to the mouth of the mine, to the woman kneeling in the dirt. Their faces were a complex tapestry of emotions. The scorn was gone, replaced by a profound, humbling shame and an awe that bordered on fear. They were looking at the person they had systematically tormented, and they owed her their lives, their husbands, their sons. The debt was too immense to ever be repaid. Harris walked through the now silent crowd to Martha's side. He placed a hand on her trembling shoulder and helped her to her feet. He didn't say a word. He simply took her hand, and together they walked away from the mine, away from the town, leaving the people of Stone Creek to reckon with the monster they had almost created, and the hero they had never deserved. In the months that followed, Stone Creek became a different place. The departure of Fletcher and his father, who sold the mine and left town under a cloud of disgrace, created a power vacuum that was filled slowly and uncertainly by a sense of collective responsibility. The townspeople tried to make amends with Martha. They brought her more business than she'd ever had, paying promptly and sometimes extra. They would greet her on the street with a respectful, "Ma'am," their eyes always carrying a trace of lingering shame. They were gestures of peace, but both they and Martha knew a true reconciliation was impossible. The wounds were too deep, the memories too clear. She accepted their business, but kept her distance, her solitude no longer a mark of ostracism, but one of quiet, dignified choice. Her work at the forge continued, the rhythmic clang of her hammer, a steady, unchanging heartbeat for the recovering town. Harris never left. The mountains still called to him, but he had found something in this dusty, flawed town that the pristine wilderness could not offer. He and Martha, together, built a small, solid cabin at the edge of the woods. He cut the timber, and she forged every nail and hinge, her strength and his skill interlocking perfectly. Their home stood just far enough away for them to have peace, but close enough to see the warm, orange glow of her forge light up the evening sky. They didn't talk much, for they didn't need to. They had learned each other's silences. He had come down from the mountains seeking supplies, a temporary engagement with the world. He had found a reason to stay, a strength that matched his own, a soul that understood the profound peace of solitude, a peace now shared. The town of Stone Creek had been given a harsh but necessary lesson, one forged in darkness and brought to light by the woman they had cast aside, that a person's worth is not measured by how they fit in with the world, but by the courage it takes to be themselves within it.